All right, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. So we are back with our tafsir. And of course, yesterday we went in, let's call it a surface tafsir for the ayat from surface tafsir from the ayat فَكُلُوا مِمَّا ذُكِرَ اسْمُ اللَّهِ عَلَيْهِ إِن كُنتُم بِآيَاتِهِ مُؤْمِنِينَ. And we talked about the context of this ayah, but at least the context in terms of idea, because the previous ayat were talking to us about, let's see, I'm going to make this one bigger right there. The previous ayat were talking about that the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was completed in honesty, in truth, in the reality of things and what they are, and plus in adl, in justice, and that there's no change to the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when we basically take that as the main keynote right there, because this was more of a conclusion to the rest of the ayat that were mentioned before, and it's also a premise to the other ayat that basically would come later. So this was the key ayah. Remember, when you look at the debate before it, it was laying out the disbelievers were basically trying to somehow change and divert the whole conversation and make it that the Prophet ﷺ was not coming with any evidence, was not coming with any miracles. So they wanted to divert that and basically try to somehow make it appear that the evidences, the miracles that he was bringing, that they really did not contain any value. They did not contain any strong points. So they started wanting to request a mountain of Mount Safa to turn into gold. And that's when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exposed that it's not the evidence that they are seeking, but they're just seeking arrogance. So then, of course, the ayah continues in regards to what actually led them to that point. What led them to that point is following Zukhruf al-Qawl, that the shayateen were laying out the different narratives, the different appealing narratives, basically to fuel their arrogance. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, فَذَرْهُمْ وَمَا يَفْتَرُونَ. And we went in details about فَذَرْهُمْ, and we said that there are certain groups that don't even waste your time in debating them. You just have to completely isolate yourself from them, because at the end of the day, they're actually seeking to drag you to their area. They're seeking to drag you to their area, and that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling us, وَلِتَصْغَى إِلَيْهِ أَفْئِدَةُ الَّذِينَ لَا يُؤْمِنُونَ بِالْآخِرَةِ. The ones that would find their words appealing would be the ones that are living their lifestyle away from the akhirah. What does it mean that they're living their lifestyle away from the akhirah? Every single behavior that you would engage in, there's always a goal to it. So if a person's goal is akhirah, that's when their behavior is basically going to be bringing in a different motive, a different implication, a different application. And why? Because their goal is akhirah. So every single behavior, there's always going to be a motive. What is your end goal? So there's an end goal, and there's that near goal, and that's leading you to the end goal. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us, well, the ones that are not having their end goal as al-akhirah, they're the ones that are going to find their words basically appealing, and then later on, after these words sounding appealing to them, and they would be, of course, getting closer to them, they would be basically giving a listening ear. That's when وَلْيَرْضَوْهُ. That's stage 2 that they'll get into, where their hearts will find it attractive, their hearts will find it something that is that they're content, that they're normalized with, they're accepting it, they're tolerating it, and then later on, وَلْيَقْتَرِفُوا مَا هُمْ مُقْتَرِفُونَ. That's when the final stage, they'll actually apply it in their life. In the beginning, They probably just overheard, they probably watched certain videos about violence, about killing, about whatever it is, or about drugs or whatever it is. Then they later on, then they had become normalized with it. After being normalized with it, then that's when they find it a lot easier to commit those actions, because they had already went through different number of stages to accept it, to tolerate it, to embrace it, to finally basically act upon it. Yet for a believer, they would recognize that they would only take Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as their hakam. Now that's that key word right there. The key word is basically that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is al-hakam, to mean that he is the center for basically helping you know truth, helping you find truth, helping you recognize truth. In other words, we're talking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being the center of truth, to recognizing what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent al-kitab mufassala, the details of truth, to help you basically recognize al-haq, and the ones that would know, the ones that would have that knowledge. And I want you to focus on this one, because the ayat were basically centering around one, recognizing knowledge, recognizing the center of truth. And it was telling us, well, there's a wahy that was sent on to you in details. How do I know the truth? How do I know the details? Well, you have to take in the time to study the truth, to study the details, of al-wahy, to have your compass in place. And that's when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, فَلَا تَكُونَنَّ مِنَ الْمُمْتَرِينَ. That wasn't telling the Prophet ﷺ, because certainly the Prophet ﷺ was not amongst the mumtareen. But in Lugha Arabiya, sometimes there can be a word that can be used, like I would tell, let's say, my older son, I would say, you know very well that you're not supposed to play with those cords. And even though my older son knows that, I would never do such a stupid thing, but I was actually telling perhaps my 4-year-old son, but I didn't want to make it seem that I was telling my 4-year-old son. So I'll tell my perhaps 15-year-old son, but the words were not directed at my 15-year-old son, because he knows very well that playing with cords is dangerous, and he's probably even so smart to even, play with cords and do the right thing. But I would make it seem that I'm talking to my 15-year-old in order to really bring the attention of my 4-year-old. Okay, and that's the same thing. So فَلَا تَكُونَنَّ مِنَ الْمُمْتَرِينَ was not directed at the Prophet ﷺ. It was more directed at, well, whether it's the Sahaba, or whether it's those that would want to take the Prophet ﷺ as an example. So telling him, فَلَا تَكُونَنَّ الْمُمْتَرِينَ, but the words were directed at basically the Muslims, to let them see that the Prophet ﷺ was directed not to be from al-Mumtareen, but certainly the Prophet ﷺ was never part of the Mumtareen. Then I'm highlighting these key points because we're going to get to a point here. وَتَمَّتْ كَلِمَةُ رَبِّكَ صِدْقًا وَعَدْلًا. That was the key sentence to let us know that the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala were complete in basically the midst of all this confusion that they had went into. What is the debate? Is it the majority? Is it basically what we would call democracy? Is it the majority opinion? Is it what makes truth? Is it the majority opinion? Is it speculation? Is it basically il-hawa that we would follow? What would make truth? So then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us one of these examples, and that's where he would say, فَكُلُوا مِمَّا ذُكِرَ اسْمُ اللَّهِ عَلَيْهِ, and eat from what had the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned on it. And certainly this wasn't talking about a slice of pizza. This is actually talking about things that are slaughtered. But of course, they came in with an objection to the believers and said, well, why would you not eat from the things that were killed or basically deceased through a natural death, but then you would say that you would slaughter something and you would consider that as something that is acceptable to eat, but not something that basically died as a result of a natural death, because the Arab did used to eat something that died of natural death. So they thought, here's a logic to object and prove the basis of legislation wrong. They wanted to prove that. Why? Because remember when we talked about al-Hakam, we talked that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was the center of knowing truth, the center of knowing basically justice, the center of knowing truth in Sidq, the center of knowing justice. And they basically had said, well, you know what? We've got the majority here accepting that it's absolutely fine, it's absolutely normal to just eat those animals that had died as a result of natural death. Then we don't understand why you would object to it and still insist that you have a point or that you have some kind of a logic that we would have to embrace. And certainly you would see this kind of objection throughout history. And I thought it would be a good idea to just kind of get an idea when it comes to the epistemology about ethics. And this is extremely important. I know I talked about this before, but I'm just going to go over it really quick. And there are a number of different epistemologies in ethics. And of course, with these different epistemologies, what do we mean by that? What would define something as right? What are the different theories in order for us to consider something as true, something as that we would turn to in evidence to prove something as being ethical or not ethical? There's actually it's 19 different lectures on YouTube for Michael, what was his name? Michael something. He was a professor at Harvard, and he basically breaks down in a beautiful way, breaks down the different theories on ethics and what determines justice and how do we prove something is basically ethical or not ethical. Although he didn't necessarily demonstrate the theory of ethics in telling us, well, all the different theories out there and what David Hume would say and what Kant would say and what, this or that scholar would say, but he wanted to let the students in. And that was the interesting part, how these students had basically debated whether something is ethical or not, and how ethics can actually change based on these definitions. Let me just go over some of those ethics. Number one is basically rationalism, and that's what the Arab wanted to say. The Arab wanted to say, well, as long as moral truth, there's basically our own acceptance. We've got, all these people accepted it, and that's why that ayah was pointing out that piece and telling us, well, وَإِن تُطِعْ أَكْثَرَ مَنْ فِي الْأَرْضِ يُضِلُّكَ. Just because something was accepted by the people, that doesn't necessarily make it the truth. And that's that rationalism. It doesn't necessarily mean that because something is accepted by the number of, one pure person and a large number of people and people in the whole world accepting it as this is morally right, that doesn't necessarily make it right just because all the people were basically accepting it. So that's what that ayah was objecting to. It was also the idea that Immanuel Kant had basically embraced and considered, and that's what he called the categorical imperative, and considered that if all the people would accept it as truth, and basically it would basically come in to have that ethical knowledge where it comes from a logical deduction. So we would recognize it's a universal rational principle, people are accepting it, then it becomes basically the moral duty that we would have to abide by. The other theory basically is considering that it's based on experience, it's based on it's basically called the empirical evidence. So when we're speaking about empiricism, we're talking about utilitarians. And the most famous one was John Stuart Mill, who basically considered that you would look at right and wrong based on the consequence. So if you see that it leads to the wrong consequence, whether it's leading to pleasure, pain, suffering, whatever it is. Now, Islam does agree with this one to a certain extent. Remember when we talked about sadd al-dhara'i, and we said, well, the ayah tells us that if something is leading to a bigger harm, then therefore we would consider by experience and by experiment and by recognizing where this is going, then that's part of the evidence to prove that something is not morally right, something is wrong. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had also mentioned that even in regards to alcohol, he said, acknowledge that there's some good in alcohol and that there's some benefit. But he said, إِثْمُهُمَا أَكْبَرُ مِنْ نَفْعِهِمَا. The harm that comes out of it is bigger than the benefit that comes out of it. And therefore, we would have to consider this basis as a basis to prove that something is morally not acceptable, looking at the consequence, looking at the suffering that it may bring. And therefore, empiricism is one way to basically weigh if something is actually morally right or not. But that's not necessarily an acceptable center. Okay, not everything we would look at the consequence alone, because just that as a human, we may lack the data to know whether we have all the information about where this is taking us, the consequence, and certainly the pain and the pleasure and the happiness and the suffering. How much of that? Where is this really? Is this really containing everything that we would know? Then there's the other source, basically the intuition, and telling us, well, there's something that is self-evident. We can basically relate it to our own intuition. We have a feeling that something is right and wrong. Just like animals, they would have some kind of intuition to know that they're not supposed to be eating from this, they're supposed to be eating from that. In other words, there's a certain instinct, and that instinct is enough for us to basically know whether something is right and wrong. But even this instinct / intuition is not enough, because we would know, Islam would object to it and say, well, your intuition is not enough because it can get contaminated. So we can't necessarily depend on that. So you had thinkers like G.E. Moore, who basically considered, well, things are self-evident. The pleasure is basically for good. Cruelty is basically bad. And that's enough for you to recognize whether something is morally acceptable or not. And there's number 4, which is looking at virtue and discipline. And that's basically something that is probably carrying the oldest one, basically considering Aristotle's virtue. And he considered that we gain more knowledge, not just by reason, but through discipline and practice. You would get the discipline, you would get the practice, and that basically would get you into a level where you would become mature enough to have the discipline to do what is right. And then you learn it by living it. And Islam agrees with this one as partially, because some of the different practices and especially when you look at tazkiyah, for example. In tazkiyah, a lot of it is, remember with that ayah, is basically telling you, well, what you really have to do is some form of a walk. you have to ذَرُوا ظَاهِرَ الْإِثْمِ وَبَاطِنَهُ. You have to leave the major sins, or you have to leave the outer sins, and you have to leave these inner sins that would be affecting you internally. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would let us know that there is a walk that you would have to walk into. أَوَمَنْ كَانَ مَيْتًا فَأَحْيَيْنَاهُ جَعَلْنَا لَهُ نُورًا يَمْشِي بِهِ. So that's basically a certain discipline, to tell us that there's a certain discipline, and therefore it's not enough to know the truth, but there's a certain discipline that you have to learn how to embrace. You have to learn how to really take in practice in order to make the change and recognize morality through practice and not necessarily only through philosophy. In other words, it's not knowing what is right and what is wrong, but sometimes you have to take the discipline and walk the walk. And just like in that ayah, فَأَيْنَ تَذْهَبُونَ, where are you going? You have to recognize it with your mind, where you're going with this, and recognize the end, basically, of your goal, that is al-akhirah. And then you have to apply a certain level of discipline, a certain level of application to recognize that that ethics, that morality is also practical knowledge. It's practical knowledge, well, where you would practice it and put it on ground, just like you would learn probably sports, or you would learn how to do certain actions, and you would learn that you would learn it in practice and not necessarily the theory of it, but then you would learn it through practice. Okay, then there's of course the one that well, basically, that considered that constructivism basically considered that it's all about what we construct through rational agreement within the society. So we would have some ideas, rational agreement within the society, we would accept it, and it becomes they're discovered, but they're not necessarily, sorry, they're not discovered, but they're actually created through different procedures, through different reasoning, through cooperation. And that's basically just something that we would construct all together. And it's not necessarily that we would discover it. Of course, Islam considers that that's not actually right. Islam considers that you don't create truth, but you discover it by recognizing it. And especially when we're talking about ethics, you don't create just by fair procedure and by having your own cooperation and reasoning that you would just basically get there. But it is also fair to say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala considered that we also have the instinct. So part of it, when we're speaking about fair procedure, we're talking about reasoning, we're talking about cooperation, even that can plagiarize from the previous philosophies, that hey, it's not just how we would construct something within the society and how we would say something is acceptable by people would basically manage to recognize that this is bringing us a good let's say consequence, then therefore since everyone is accepting it, let's just move towards that end. So therefore, Islam considers that you've got a basis. You have to have a basis, and it's not enough. So Islam considers that there is a basis that you would have to go back to in order to recognize truth. In order to recognize truth, you would basically have to recognize that there is a divine command. There's a divine command, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically considering that there's that source, that source that is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is al-wahi. Al-wahi. Now, of course, in other religions, whether we're talking about, like Christianity, they would consider the Ten Commandments, and perhaps maybe other, well, I mean, religion basically, like let's say Buddhism, and well, same thing with Judaism, considers that the basis is basically the Talmud in understanding morality, because that was their interpretation. But of course, at the end, they would agree that divine command is basically the basis. So how is Islam different from those? The Islam is different basically in number one, الوحي تمت كلمة ربك صدقا وعدلا. So how is Islam different? Well, Islam is different because of this key one. This key one, تمت كلمة ربك صدقا. So with the scripture itself, is it containing a sidq? The scripture itself, is it containing al-adl? Absolutely. So with Hinduism, they definitely have their reference as well. Their references as well. And it's not just Hinduism. We talk about Buddhism, you talk about Christianity, you talk about shamanism, each and every single religion, they would basically have their reference in regards to what they would consider as this is our reference to knowing whether it's in whether in dealing with the society, or whether it's the basis in understanding morality and so forth. And this is extremely important. So there's the other part. In different religions, they might consider natural law. That's Thomas Aquinas, he was the one that considered, who actually, I would say, when you look at Thomas Aquinas, you would think that he was probably reading from Islamic thought, and you would see always considering that we have to reflect on God's creation, and that the universe itself basically tells us that there's an order, and which is really similar to what Islam was saying. You wonder if Thomas Aquinas was actually reading something on probably Ghazali, and that's where he probably got those ideas from. Because in Islam, the whole natural law theory, or that whole idea of looking at nature and getting the idea, or at least getting that inspiration from nature, whether it's in fitra, or whether it's in how we would see that design in nature. And that's telling us that we too, as part of what was created in part of nature, then therefore there's a certain law, there's a certain structure that we should be basically living in, and getting the different inspiration from nature to let us know how we could use just basic moral truth, and how protecting life is good, injustice is bad, and just looking at these combinations of reason and plus divine order, basically from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And certainly the other piece is looking at virtues basically through discipline. And of course, just like you were talking about Hinduism before, in Islam, of course, we would say it's tazkiyah. We would use different methods of tazkiyah, whether, through the different teachings that trace back all the way to the Prophet ﷺ, okay, all the way to the Prophet ﷺ, all the way to the Quran. And we had different scholars actually teach about tazkiyah, whether speaking about the heart, or whether speaking about practice, or whether, in other words, discipline, or whether we're speaking about the soul, or whether we're speaking about the nafs, or whether we're speaking about the mind, and how all those areas basically play a role in making us walk, in making us, of course, walk is a metaphor. This isn't necessarily talking about walking per se, but this is talking about how you would live your life based on a certain principle. And certainly with this whole area in speaking about of course, the Buddhists have the same concept right there, right? It's trying to focus on the inner heart, and the Buddhists would basically call it the Eightfold Path, and Christianity would call it the Aztec practices. And of course, every single religion has its, and of course, same thing when we're talking about Judaism, they would have what would be the kosher, what would be something that is right, and basically go back to the Talmud to define what is right and what is wrong. So every single religion basically has its source of moral knowledge to live a certain religious life, through discipline, through worship, and that's basically what would shape the heart and recognize the truth, and basically the heart would recognize the moral truth, etc. And then therefore they would consider that as ethics as basically experiential, and it's spiritual knowledge that you would develop through practicing faith. And certainly in that there is that piece of intuition or intuitive knowledge. How do we understand intuitive knowledge? So with intuitive knowledge is this basically direct experience of God or divine reality. That's where Sufism would, I would say, many times get into a very, I would say, a very dangerous spot, because the second that you would, get into that intuitive knowledge, that's when you get into that confusion. Sometimes, is this shaitan wahi, or is this divine wahi? So that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling us, tammat kalimatu rabbik. Go back to the Quran and Sunnah, and that's basically the most important reference that you would want to go to, and to somehow get into this intuitive knowledge or intuitive, let's say, source, then you may sometimes confuse things. Well, here's one thing, is that sometimes it's not all necessarily coming from intuitive to mean to just, speak about that, somehow I got a certain feeling, but that's when, sometimes even those that are not considered Sufi may use things like, well, we got a dream. I had a dream about this. I was listening to the podcast, a podcast for Salih Adli, who basically had translated the books for Sayyid Qutb, and what inspired him to translate those books and the works of Sayyid Qutb was really a dream. He got a dream that he was supposed to translate the books into English to make it available for Pakistanis. That's what the dream was saying. Okay, to make it available for Pakistanis, even though Pakistanis spoke Urdu, but the majority living in UK, they basically speak English, and majority of them were Pakistani. So it doesn't have to be Pakistani as in Pakistani, within nationality, but it's basically for the Ummah, the English-speaking Ummah, that basically had English as a resource that they would basically have English available to them to make it available. Okay, but like I said, that intuitive knowledge, sometimes getting the inspiration through a dream, basically just like that, or perhaps sometimes that the Prophet ﷺ in the hadith, he basically said in the hadith, al-ithmu ma haka fi qalbik, or fi nafsik, just by looking at ithm. What is ithm? He said, al-ithmu ma haka fi nafsik. Ithm is what you recognize, sin. You would recognize through your intuition that there's something wrong with it. وَكَرِهْتَ أَن يَطَّلِعَ عَلَيْهِ النَّاسِ. And you would hate people seeing you in that sin. That's your intuition helping you recognize whether something is right or wrong, and that's that intuition. So it's not necessarily Sufi to say intuitive knowledge, because even the hadith were giving us that some intuition may be a source to help us recognize right and wrong. So when you look at religion itself, you could see that other religions would consider discipline as a way, whether we're speaking about intuition, whether we're speaking about virtue through religious discipline, or whether we're looking at natural law. So we could say that in other religions, that divine command theory, etc., all of that's basically considering that that this is a practice. That's something that they would go back to consider something as truth or not. So Islam comes in, and even though they had said, that is the pagan Arab, they had said, well, hey, our reference is that most of the people within our society, they would consider that eating dead animals or animals that died of natural disasters, that it's absolutely moral to eat these animals. That's when Islam comes in and says, well, here's the instruction. And this is extremely important. There's an instruction, there's a direction, and certainly part of that is basically coming in by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala telling us, well, there's an instruction. For instruction, it basically has to come with sidq. There has to be a basis for instruction, and that is truth. And then there's the direction, which is basically supposed to be based on justice, on adl. Who defines adl? What defines adl? And that's when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically lets us know that in order to define adl, you would basically have to have a source. You would have to have that basis of al-hakam. And that's why tawheed is the basis for recognizing al-haq and al-adl. Basically, the recognizing truth and instruction and recognizing direction. All right, and that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions right there. وَمَا لَكُمْ أَلَّا تَأْكُلُوا مِمَّا ذُكِرَ اسْمُ اللَّهِ عَلَيْهِ. Why would you not eat what had the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned on it? وَقَدْ فَصَّلَ لَكُمْ مَا حَرَّمَ عَلَيْكُمْ. And this is a key thing, that in Islam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically had given us the details. Well, wait a minute. I mean, different religions also have details, just like when you talked about, for example, in Hinduism, they would also have certain Vedanta, for example, in Christianity, mysticism, and of course, they would also have their way of trying to get intuitive knowledge. Can we consider that as a basis that we would basically turn to? And that's why Islam basically lets us know that certainly there are certain paths, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَقَدْ فَصَّلَ لَكُمْ مَا حَرَّمَ عَلَيْكُمْ. He had basically given you the instruction, given you the direction, because human knowledge or human practices or human interpretation in human reading is basically limited, and you cannot necessarily depend on it entirely and fully, and you may get into these confusions that would basically be coming from al-wahi, that is the inspiration coming from shaitan. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would let us know that in order for you to recognize the truth, I want you to examine the inspiration, the revelation, the words that were sent onto Muhammad ibn Abdullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and then recognize that since that contains the truth, then you would look into all the different legislation, all the different details of it as basically containing the truth and recognizing that piece of it. All right, let's continue it right there. وَذَرُوا ظَاهِرَ الْإِثْمِ وَبَاطِنَهُ إِنَّ الَّذِينَ يَكْسِبُونَ الْإِثْمَ سَيُجْزَوْنَ بِمَا كَانُوا يَقْتَرِفُونَ ولا تأكلوا مما لم يذكر اسم الله عليه وإنه لفسق وإن الشياطين ليوحون إلى أوليائهم ليجادلوكم وإن أطعتموهم إنكم لمشركون. I want to take you into Tafseer al-Qurtubi now. I think it would be fair let's just go for Tafseer al-Qurtubi in order to explain some of these ayat. I know we kind of went a little off, but I thought it was very important to see what the ayat were basically letting us know, that in order to recognize something is being morally acceptable, whether it's in eating or whether it's in marriage or whether it's in transactions or whether it's in judging or whatever it is, and recognizing right and wrong, all of that, you would basically take Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as one, il-hakam, as the one that is al-hakam, and two, all the different details, they must come from al-haq and al-adl, okay? All right. So, but of course, certain details also need some referencing right there in terms of the context and looking at the books of Tafsir and what they had said. Okay, so let's go back to al-Qurtubi. Al-Qurtubi said, فَكُلُوا مِمَّا ذُكِرَ اسْمُ اللَّهِ عَلَيْهِ. As in terms of this ayah, he said it was revealed because a group of people, they had come to the Prophet ﷺ, and they said, "O Prophet of Allah, we would eat what we would kill, but we wouldn't eat what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had killed, basically is a natural disaster or natural, basically, natural killing, the way that it was killed naturally, basically." So that's when the ayah was revealed, فَكُلُوا إِلَى قَوْلِهِ وَإِنْ أَطَعْتُمُوهُمْ إِنَّكُمْ لَمُشْرِكُونَ. So basically this ayah was revealed. Let's say, so فَكُلُوا, where was it? فَكُلُوا, right there. So it was based then, according to this hadith, based on this hadith that was narrated by Tirmidhi, that this ayah up until وَإِنْ أَطَعْتُمُوهُمْ إِنَّكُمْ لَمُشْرِكُونَ, and if you were to obey them, then you would be mushrikun. Let's see, where up until where? وَإِنْ أَطَعْتُمُوهُمْ إِنَّكُمْ لَمُشْرِكُونَ. Okay. بأهوائهم, right there. Right there. وَإِنْ أَطَعْتُمُوهُمْ إِنَّكُمْ لَمُشْرِكُونَ. Okay, so basically all these ayat right there. فَكُلُوا مِمَّا ذُكِرَ اسْمُ اللَّهِ عَلَيْهِ, up from here all the way until here, that was revealed for basically responding to that question. That was basically the context of these ayat. Okay, but when you remember when we had always said al-ibra bi'umum al-lafzi la bi khusus al-sabab, that it's not necessarily the context of the ayah and what basically what resulted in the revelation of that ayah, but we would look at the theme. We would look at the theme of that ayah and what it contained, all right? And the coherence within these ayat basically lets us know that it was talking about letting us learn that Tawheed is the key. And that's why it said, وَإِنْ أَطَعْتُمُوهُمْ إِنَّكُمْ لَمُشْرِكُونَ. If you were to obey them, then you would be basically mushrikeen. What is that supposed to mean? If I were, here's the question. If I were to, let's say, apply Western law, does that make me a mushrik just by applying it? Because it said, وَإِنْ أَطَعْتُمُوهُمْ إِنَّكُمْ لَمُشْرِكُونَ. No, it doesn't make you a mushrik if you were to obey, let's say, things that do not contradict the religion. What if I were to obey them in things that contradict the religion? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَإِنْ أَطَعْتُمُوهُمْ إِنَّكُمْ لَمُشْرِكُونَ. If you were to obey them, you would be basically polytheists. You would be amongst their religion. So why would it say that? So why was it saying وَإِنْ أَطَعْتُمُوهُمْ إِنَّكُمْ لَمُشْرِكُونَ? But we know that if you were to do something against the religion, that doesn't necessarily get you out of the fold of Islam. But why was it saying إِنْ أَطَعْتُمُوهُمْ إِنَّكُمْ لَمُشْرِكُونَ? Remember, when we talked about al-fisq, we said that there's a major fisq and there's a minor fisq. The major fisq would basically be a person acting or behaving in their faith outside of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had regarded right or wrong. Okay, we talked about that yesterday. And in fact, I think I still have, okay, here we go. Let's see, right there, yesterday. Let me show it to you, and let me show you what we did yesterday. This is what we did yesterday. Okay. And we went in details with al-fisq al-akbar and al-fisq al-asghar, the major fisq and the minor fisq, and we went in details with that. Remember that one. Now, when we speak about al-fisq al-akbar, that's what would lead to shirk. Al-fisq al-akbar is basically when a person is not believing in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's al-fisq al-akbar. Okay, al-fisq al-asghar is a person not practicing and basically having the moral reference not be Islam, but be the other practices not coming from Islam, whether it's from dhann or whether it's from hawa. Okay, so when it said وَإِنَّهُ لَفِسْقٌ, so here's the question, is another question. I know that I'm not answering yet the questions and all of those questions, but I'm putting in a number of questions, and then hopefully the idea will be there. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَلَا تَأْكُلُوا مِمَّا لَمْ يُذْكَرِ اسْمُ اللَّهِ عَلَيْهِ, and don't eat from what did it have the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned on it. And if you were to do it, well, then it would be fisq. So if I were not to eat dhabiha, does that mean I had become a mushrik? No, that's a sin. That's a sin if a person were to eat non-dhabiha. It's not kufr. But if a person had regarded that there's nothing wrong with eating non-dhabiha, for example, or nothing wrong with zina, or nothing wrong with or creating their own narrative, nothing wrong with not wearing hijab. If a person were to object and were to believe in other than what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had regarded as halal or haram, or regarded as ethical, not ethical, or regarded as the parameters of what the religion stands for, and they would have their own views on it, and they would say, well, here's how I would have my own interpretation, here's how I understand it, here's how I would think that this is not something I agree with, then that's innakum la mushrikun. Say a woman comes up and she says, I agree with everything in Islam, but polygamy. Innakum la mushrikun. Right there. Then you had committed shirk. Why? Because you just denied something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had regarded as part of the religion. Or to say things like, well, I think it's not fair. Well, that's shirk. That's fisq akbar. Or I think it's against women's rights. That's fisq akbar. Why? Because you had, at that moment, you had basically considered the reference to understanding morality or understanding ethics as other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had said, تَمَّتْ كَلِمَةُ رَبِّكَ صِدْقًا وَعَدْلًا, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had said, the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala were complete in sidq, in the truth that they were revealed in, and in containing the justice and basically the complete foundation of justice, and also fasl. And when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically given us قَدْ فَصَّلَ لَكُمْ مَا حَرَّمَ عَلَيْكُمْ, and given us the details in what was considered as not permissible and or what is permissible. Layla, go ahead, dear. You wanted to say something.
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum.
If you say in the context of like polygamy, you say it's not right because he's not financially just say his circumstances doesn't allow him to marry a second wife. Is that fisq or?
No, it's not fisq, because you are not objecting on a law, you're objecting on how it's applied. Okay, You're objecting on whether they had applied the practice based on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's definition of adl. All right. But here's the thing. Let's just say, okay, let's just say this man was not financially competent and capable to get married to a second wife. Okay. So definitely he didn't practice it right. But does that marriage basically become invalid? No, it doesn't. The marriage itself doesn't become invalid. But his practice was not based on the complete adl that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had mentioned as a prescription on how to practice it. All right. So the prescription is right. You're not objecting to the prescription. You're not objecting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but you're objecting to the way that this person had applied it. But the marriage itself is actually valid. All right. The marriage is valid. This is not a sin, but he is committing a sin for committing, in this situation, for example, for committing an injustice in basically providing for the families in what is basically considered as a necessity for both families, and that it was his responsibility to provide for both families. Okay, so that would not be shirk. But it would be shirk to say, well, I don't believe in polygamy, or I don't believe in, well, at least polygamy, if we're talking about, you know, there are all these different theories. Even if you were to go to the dictionary, I find that, you know, there's, you know, the different dictionaries. Is it polyandry? Is it polygamy? Is it polygamy with an N? And then it's quite strange that, you know, they would basically sometimes contradict each other. Which one is having more than one husband, or which one is having more than one wife? So, but we all agree that we're talking about having more than one wife and not having more than one husband. Okay. فَكُلُوا مِمَّا ذُكِرَ اسْمُ اللَّهِ عَلَيْهِ, that it was revealed onto that. Let's go to number 6. It's, let's see, what did he say? It was basically narrated mursala. I want to look at this one. When you say mursala, scholars actually had differences of opinions on taking the hadith that is mursala. First of all, what does a mursala mean? There are different classifications for a weak hadith. So some scholars like Ibn Salah, who was a major scholar, who wrote Tadrib al-Rawi. It's a huge 2 volumes. Every volume is almost 500 pages. So it's like a huge 1,000-page 2 volumes. And Ibn Salah, and he basically says that the classification of hadith da'if is 69 different classifications. So not because something is considered as da'if that you would just reject it. Oh, it's weak, we're going to reject that. Not quite. There are certain hadith that are considered da'if, that are considered weak, but we would still take them as a reference and as a valid resource, even though they are weak. Okay. So not just because it's weak, we would just reject it like that. Okay. One of those kinds of the 69 classifications is a mursal. A mursal, we would have the tabi'i narrate the hadith, but then we would have that missing link of who that sahabi, who that companion that heard the hadith is. So we would basically say that this hadith is mursal. We don't have the complete chain of narration, and but we do have a reference that it was basically mentioned by multiple tabi'in. Ata ibn Sa'ib, Sa'id ibn Jubair, in that they had narrated upon Abdullah ibn Abbas. So do we have that missing link of who that sahabi is? Is it Abdullah ibn Abbas? And you would have, and of course, Sa'id ibn Jubair is not a sahabi. We all know that. Okay. We all know that he's not a sahabi, he's a tabi'i. He was actually executed by Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf al-Thaqafi, okay, 95 Hijriya. But at the same time, you could see that it was narrated by them. So regardless of the context, of course, to answer some of those questions, keep in mind that if a person were to object on the rulings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and regard that some of the rulings are not fair or that it is not necessarily morally complete, then that's basically a part of shirk. That's shirk, because to regard whether the Western society or the Western culture or I don't know, the definition of Simone de Beauvoir and her feminism and her whatever, or John Paul Sartre or whatever it is, or regard John Locke as, here's what defines truth and what defines ethics and etc., then in that situation you would basically be considered as mushrik, because you put this philosopher or you put that person or you put this society as basically the one to define truth, to define ethics and morality, and not Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That in that situation you had just committed shirk, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَا كَانَ لِمُؤْمِنٍ وَلَا مُؤْمِنَةٍ إِذَا قَضَى اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ أَمْرًا أَن يَكُونَ لَهُمُ الْخِيرَةُ مِنْ أَمْرِهِمْ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says it is not befit for a believing man or a believing woman, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decrees a matter, that they would have their own opinion or their own take, or their own take on any matter be before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or be taken beyond Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's decree. When you say it is not befit, that would basically fall within in ata'tumuhum innakum mushrikun. If you were to obey them, then you would be committing shirk. Okay, let's go for the other ayah. وَمَا لَكُمْ أَلَّا تَأْكُلُوا مِمَّا ذُكِرَ اسْمُ اللَّهِ عَلَيْهِ. This is basically saying, well, what would prevent you if you were to eat from what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically permitted for you to eat from, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you فَصَّلَ لَكُمْ. فَصَّلَ لَكُمْ means given you all the details, given you the explanation of what makes something is right or not. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala given you all the details, then that's basically to take away any form of doubt or any form of confusion. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically lets us know that you've got the details, no need to go to other resources, whether you were talking about philosophers, you're talking about discipline, and this is extremely important. This is extremely important. So I don't need to learn mysticism through, or how to practice and how to get tazkiyah, not through Thomas Aquinas, or not through the untouchables, or to go to Hindus, or to go to Buddhists, or go to Tao, or whatever it is. I would basically go back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. قَدْ فَصَّلَ لَكُمْ مَا حَرَّمَ عَلَيْكُمْ. You would go back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You don't need to go back to all these different areas and think that, oh, I'm learning how to embrace spirituality and how to embrace discipline through them. You embrace it through Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala giving you all the details. No need to go to other religions. No need to go to mushrikeen to help you understand what discipline is, or to help you understand what morality is. You don't need to go to mushrikeen. تمت كلمة ربك صدقا وعدلا. Okay, so what about this ayah that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically says, إِلَّا مَا اضْطُرِرْتُمْ إِلَيْهِ. Okay, so basically telling me, let's go back to it right there, and let's say, hold on, let's see, وَمَا لَكُمْ أَلَّا تَأْكُلُوا مِمَّا ذُكِرَ اسْمُ اللَّهِ عَلَيْهِ وَقَدْ فَصَّلَ لَكُمْ مَا حَرَّمَ عَلَيْكُمْ إِلَّا مَا اضْطُرِرْتُمْ إِلَيْهِ. What is it اضطررتم? What is it ضرورة? الضرورة, or necessity. Okay, necessity is basically when your DNAIM is at stake, but not too fast. Okay, because الضرورة تقدر بقدرها. Let's write that down. All right, we're gonna write that down. So when we speak about الضرورة, or let's write first الضرورات. Sorry, but الضرورات تبيح المحظورات. المحظورات. That's a key قاعدة or a key legal maxim in Islam. الضرورات تبيح المحظورات. Necessities permit the forbidden things. But here's one thing. Many would take this legal maxim out of context and not understand that there are many legal maxims that fall underneath this one. Part of it, الضرورة تقدر بقدرها. Part of that is basically considering that how much of darura do we consider? So that's why the scholar said, الضرورة تقدر بقدرها. What does that mean? So if I said you had basically a qualified necessity to do or basically do what is haram because your life is at risk, then we would say الضرورة تقدر بقدرها. Necessity, we would look at the situation. So let's say you were stranded in, I don't know, I can't say the desert because you wouldn't find this in the desert. You would, let's say you were stranded in a forest. I don't know. Okay. And you managed to somehow catch a wild pig. I don't know how, because wild pigs, they actually come in groups, but you managed to do it. I don't know, you managed to catch a wild pig, okay? And you were stranded in this forest, and you either eat this wild pig or you basically die of hunger. You need the protein, okay? So what do? You basically, hey, you managed to catch it, and yeah, you ate and you made it into this barbecue. You managed to make fire, you made it into a barbecue, and you started eating it, okay? But here's the thing. While you were eating it, you basically discovered that, hey, it was delicious, okay? And you were like, well, I've got the necessity right there. I basically started doing this and I discovered that it was delicious and I'm gonna basically eat more and more and more. No. الضرورة تقدر بقدرها. You would basically eat just the amount to help you through your survival, but not necessarily eat to fill your stomach, just to help you through survival, okay? So الضرورة تقدر بقدرها. So when we look at this one, and when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِلَّا مَا اضْطُرِرْتُمْ إِلَيْهِ, that's also to let us know that when we speak about ethics, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, yes, has these parameters, these legal maxims, but these legal maxims are basically to help us recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically allowed certain rulings to be outside of that parameter only in situations of necessity. Only in situations of necessity, but in the end is that to take in the parameters of the religion, the halal and haram, this is to maintain aqidah. Keep that in mind. This is to maintain what? This is to maintain aqidah. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَإِنَّ كَثِيرًا لَيُضِلُّونَ بِأَهْوَائِهِمْ بِغَيْرِ عِلْمٍ. Many would misguide the others just by بِأَهْوَائِهِمْ, with their own desire. So before, they basically thought that they had a rational argument, but then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling us, well, you know what? They will also use their own desires as a way to delude and to misguide and to redefine morality. To redefine morality. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then tells us, well, there is a certain practice. Just keep in mind, how can we get into accepting ithm? How can we get into that point where we might not just accept perhaps the different interpretations, but in the beginning, just like when we were talking about وَلِتَصْغَى إِلَيْهِ أَفْئِدَةُ الَّذِينَ لَا يُؤْمِنُونَ بِالْآخِرَةِ, it was basically taking into different parameters that some they will get off the right practice just by exposing themselves to that area. But then in the other one, he's telling us that what might even take us out of Tawheed. So in this one, it basically would, in this ayah, would tell us what takes them out of Tawheed and basically focused on the practice. Okay. But in this ayah, it was basically telling us, well, the practice itself can even affect your own aqidah, your tawheed, the practice itself. So that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us, ذَرُوا ظَاهِرَ الْإِثْمِ وَبَاطِنَ. Avoid the major sin and avoid the minor sin, or avoid the apparent sin and the internal sins, the external sins and the internal sins, because at the end of the day, it will affect your iman. It will affect your tawheed. In the beginning, you're just probably thinking of it as just a ma'asiyah, and that it doesn't affect your Islam. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us know that no, there are certain ma'asi, there are certain sins that have the momentum, that have the power to even take you out of faith itself. They have the power to affect your mind. They have the power to affect your spirituality. They have the power to affect your heart. And this is extremely important. Just like when we speak about the society, in where this ayah was telling us, وَلِتَصْغَى إِلَيْهِ أَفْئِدَةُ الَّذِينَ لَا يُؤْمِنُونَ بِالْآخِرَةِ, telling us and giving us that indication that certainly just by you sitting around certain people, just by you basically having this relationship, your mind, your brain synchronizes with the brain that you are surrounding yourself with. It literally synchronizes with the brains with the people that you're surrounding yourself with, and you will start believing in the same stuff that they are believing in. They just download it into your brain, and without you realizing, acting like a Wi-Fi, that information that they were believing in. And that's why, hey, we mirror the people around us. You would be talking, and the person next to you is probably completing the sentence before you would even complete it. You would say, well, everything that comes out of and you would say, well, mouth. I didn't even need to say it, because your brain had already set a pattern based on the language, based on the society, based on the culture, and this pattern, your brain basically gets accustomed to it. And that's why Islam was telling you, I want you to make sure that you recognize who the people around you are, whether in who you're listening to or who you are basically taking your practices from. What are those cultures that are surrounding you? Who are these people? How are they synchronizing your brain? How are they downloading certain information and making you think that something is rational, something's acceptable? How are they affecting you? How are they affecting your religion? All of that. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, well, I want you to leave and abandon entirely the external sin and the internal sin, and your references would basically go back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because that's going to be the reference to help you identify truth. And that's the way to help you stay within the perimeter of faith. So that's why it continues right there and basically tells us that certainly Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala فَصَّلَ لَكُم مَا حَرَّمَ عَلَيْكُم. In another qira'ah, basically فَصَّلَ لَكُم مَا حَرَّمَ عَلَيْكُم, basically فَصَّلَ having with the fa, with basically the verb, the past tense, like the past tense. In another qira'ah, فُصِّلَ لَكُم مَا حُرِّمَ عَلَيْكُم. So when you say فُصِّلَ, that's in فُصِّلَ was, it was. I thought, so that would be, it was given, it was basically given to you, that is the details. فصل لكم ما حرم عليكم. So whether we're speaking about the past tense, the near past tense, or the farther past tense, basically, in اللغة العربية we would basically know the grammar in Arabic is different than the grammar in English, so I'll use these terms that like there's no such thing. So I'll just use the term that is at least the closest to what I could think of as in Arabic. Okay. All right, let's see. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had told us, Alif Lam Ra Kitabun Uhkimat Ayatu Thumma Fussilat. Basically telling us, Alif Lam Ra Kitabun Uhkimat Ayatu. Its verses were basically revealed in complete revelation, and then the details were given in details, basically. All right, let's see. I'm just gonna skip some of the things right there. وَإِنَّ كَثِيرًا لَيُضِلُّونَ, and because we talked about this, يُضِلُّونَ to come from delude. Okay, and what are they deluding with? They're deluding بِأَهْوَائِهِمْ. Why بِأَهْوَائِهِمْ? Because they were using their own desires and their own wrong take and their own logic, and which they thought was logic, but in the truth of the matter is that it wasn't logic, it was their own desires. What is the difference? So logic would basically say, well, I've got this rational statement, and then therefore I would build, if A equals B, then B equals D, then A equals D. Okay, so that would be saying, well, this is logic. But there are certain things that in ethics, it doesn't actually always go in this type of mathematical reading. Okay. وَذَرُوا ظَاهِرَ الْإِثْمِ وَبَاطِنَهُ. Let's see. He said scholars actually had different interpretations on that. And he said أَقْوَالٌ كَثِيرًا. Many interpretations. When he says ذَرُوا ظَاهِرَ الْإِثْمِ, avoid ظاهر. What is the word ظاهر? ظاهر actually means what was supposed to be a behavior that is external, basically done through the body, physical behavior. Okay, باطنة is basically what would be internal in the heart, and anything that basically is done, whether external sin, that you would practice your legs, you would walk to something, you would probably use your hand to commit a certain sin, etc. Well, that is basically going against the order of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, but in order to be at the highest level of faith, just like in Surah Al-Ma'idah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, ثُمَّ اتَّقَوْا وَآمَنُوا ثُمَّ اتَّقَوْا وَأَحْسَنُوا. It's two levels. اتَّقَوْا and then آمَنُوا. That's the stage after Iman. Stage after Iman, after Islam, is اتَّقَوْا وَاتَّقَوْا وَآمَنُوا. They would have taqwa, and they would get into the level of Iman. And then there's the level after it, اتقوا وأحسنوا. اتقوا وأحسنوا. اتقوا وأحسنوا is basically a higher level. They would have taqwa and basically become muhsin. Well, the difference between the level of Iman and the level of Ihsan, I think we said it many times, so no need to repeat it. Okay, so this is basically right there. المرتبة الثالثة, he says. It says only the person that would reach the level التقوى and الإحسان, just like in this one, and then المرتبة الثالثة, the third level, or the third stage, would basically be this one. ذروا ظاهر الإثم وباطنه. Are we capable of avoiding sin that we would do on the inside? Like, what does that look like? For example, like envying somebody. I mean, I just wish that I would have something similar. That's not envy. That's permissible. You just wish to have maybe a beautiful house like her house. But the negative envy is that you wish that her house would burn down and you would get a house. That's haram. That's haram. Okay. And certainly Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Daru ظاهر الإثم وباطنه." Avoid the inner sin and the external sin. إن الذين يكسبون الإثم, those that would get al-ithm. Which kind of ithm? Both the inner ithm and the external ithm. Okay? And okay. ولا تأكلوا مما لم يذكر اسم الله عليه وإنه لفسق وإن الشياطين ليوحون إلى أوليائهم ليجادلوكم وإن أطعتموهم إنكم لمشركون. Don't eat from what did not have the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned on it. Now, al-Qurtubi says there are 5 different issues in regards to this ayah. Here's what we'll do. I'm going to stop right here. Okay? And inshallah, not tomorrow, because tomorrow we've got an off. The day after tomorrow, inshallah, we'll complete and we'll talk about the details that al-Qurtubi talked about, inshallah, in regards to this ayah. And inshallah, we will complete it, not tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, inshallah. If there are any questions regards to what we had talked about today, let's see. Sister saying, I have a question in ruqya and hijama. I got it done the moment the center of head got cupped. I had a reaction, uncontrollable tears, and some trembling and flashbacks of regrets. Is this jinn or evil eye? No. It's not necessarily jinn or evil eye. No. Il-hijama, many would think that, hijama is a physical treatment. And also some scholars would say it's a spiritual treatment as well. But wallahu alam, it's just a physical treatment and not necessarily anything that may relate to jinn or anything of or evil eye or anything of that sort. Okay. Wallahu alam, there's nothing related to that. It is more of a perhaps maybe at that moment, I don't know if you had it at your head. I don't know if, maybe a neurologist would probably, or a neuroscientist would tell me, what really happened. And, when if you were to get maybe, I don't know, maybe a hit on the head, and you probably remember certain things or probably forget certain things, a neuroscientist would probably have a better explanation than me to, understanding what really happened and why did you get these flashbacks. I don't know. It has nothing to do with jinn, at least from nothing to do with jinn, nothing to do with shayateen. Just like if you were to get, let's say, a blood draw, does that necessarily mean that if you somehow probably started shaking from the blood draw, does that mean shaitan somehow was in that syringe and somehow got affected by that syringe? No, it's something physical, not related to jinn or shayateen. Let's see, I know some people were writing about kashf right there. I think I talked about kashf before, that intuition that some in Sufism would basically take as a resource, a divine knowledge basically coming to that person because they're near Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We talked about some of that as well. So we'll stop right here, and if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, inshallah. Layla, go ahead, dear.
So the 2 darura that you mentioned, there was one that it's just like temporary, and there was, I don't know if I understood this right. The other one is like long term. Is it
long term?
No. The first one you said it was the
الضرورة تقدر الضرورات تبيح المحظورات والضرورة تقدر
yeah
بقدر.
تقدر بقدر. Yeah.
الضرورة تقدر بقدرها. I know this is lined up differently, but الضرورات تبيح المحظورات. Not المحظورات تبيح الضرورات, but because I basically am not, the lining basically flipped it. But الضرورات تبيح المحظورات والضرورة تقدر بقدرها. الضرورات تبيح المحظورات والضرورة تقدر بقدرها. What about it?
Was one just like you said, the first one, المحظورات, is that the on like the example you gave, only necessity if the life depended on it? And then are they two different separate daruras? That's what basically.
No, it's the same darura.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's the same darura. Okay. These aren't the only ones in regards to darurat tubih al-mahdhurat. There are a whole set of different limitations and regulations on how we would embrace darura. But this is just one of them. But there are a lot of different legal maxims that relate to darurat tubih al-mahdhurat and how much of this darura we would take. Many times people would basically say, well, yeah, I need this really bad. And therefore, I need to go to work, and therefore it would be permissible for me to buy a car using interest. I will say, wait a minute, you've got the option to basically go by train or by bus, or perhaps maybe buy a car that you can afford, and it doesn't have to be, this car that's $28,000 and you paying loans on it. But no, you can get a car that's probably $3,000, and yes, it's not necessarily doing the same job, but it would still be within the functioning darurat tubih al-mahdhurat. Would be, hey, you've got right there, probably affording a car that's for $3,000 is probably different, and in fact it is different than buying a car with $28,000 and paying basically interest on it. So no, you can afford to buy a $3,000 car. We'll buy a $3,000 car. If you're able to do that, yeah, but I would have to take it to a dealer, and I would have to take it to basically the auto shop every couple months to fix it, etc. Well, yes, at the end, you want to remember is that once you can afford to buy something better, go ahead and good luck. But that doesn't permit that you would take interest. And we see that a lot of times, people basically being so lenient on taking interest and thinking that الضرورات تبيح المحظورات, and yeah, I need it. Just for the need, that doesn't make it a necessity. Ustaz Ubay, go ahead, dear.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Yeah, how I make sure that the meat or the stuff that's in the restaurant here in this country, that it's they mention the name of Allah, they slaughter it.
We're going to talk about this, inshallah, the day after tomorrow. Is that meat that did not have the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned on it, okay, is that necessarily haram or not? Is that considered halal? Is that considered dhabiha, okay, that we're permitted to eat from or not? We're going to get into those details, and inshallah on Monday, so stay tuned. I know that certain cultures are very strict in their definition of dhabiha, and I'll use the word strict for now. Maybe they are right. Maybe this is what we're supposed to be basically defining as dhabiha, and we're going to get to some of the things. Well, what about the meat that we would have in stores? What about the meat that was probably imported from Thailand or whatever country, and it doesn't have halal on it, but is it halal? Or imported from, I don't know, China or whatever it is, they're canned foods. What about the foods that I would give my cat if it's not halal? Is that okay too? Or am I not even allowed to buy it? Stay tuned, right? I know, believe it or not, there's a debate on this. So stay tuned.
Eat free food.
Well, I mean, it's, because it's haram to buy something haram, right? So am I supposed to make sure that my cat is eating halal? Or is it that I'm supposed to be making sure that I'm buying halal? Because I'm not permitted to buy haram. And wait a minute, wait. You're not just talking about buying. Forget about the cat. What about me? Can I buy from this or that? And it doesn't say halal, but I just know it's beef.
Yeah.
And I just know it was slaughtered in the slaughterhouse in the US. That's all it says on. So yeah, how do I understand whether it's halal or haram? And plus, the ones that sell in halal, like they sell it way more expensive than the other ones. Okay, we're gonna get into details. Stay tuned for more day after tomorrow. This is probably, you know what? I think we did actually go in details with this
Book.
right, with this one. I think we went in details in the beginning of Surah al-Ma'idah. We did, but we're gonna still go over a little bit. It wouldn't hurt, right? Yeah, inshallah. So this is it, inshallah. Subhanakallah wa bihamdik, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk, nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant. We'll stop the live stream and then we'll get